Welcome to East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce. We're very glad to have you here. And as you know, this is one of our special events under our Chamber Low Carbon programme, which we've entitled A Conversation With, and in this case, it's with Emma Howard-Boyd, who is the chair of the Environment Agency. So welcome to Emma, and also welcome to Keith Ashcroft, who's the area director of the Environment Agency for Cumbria and Lancashire. So these are great friends of ours. As those of you who have worked with us for a long time know, we have an awful lot of activity locally in the low carbon space, supporting businesses and the agenda across the wider area. And you'll learn a little bit more about that, I think, in some of the introductions to some of the questions. But this is very much about sharing the thoughts of our senior friends here from the Environment Agency about the challenges that are facing us and the opportunities and the activities that the Environment Agency is very much working in partnership with us on, especially in the run-up to COP26. So the first question is very much of an open question, I think, Emma, designed to really allow you the opportunity to give whatever background you want to do. Basically, looking at the Environment Agency, we all know the Environment Agency as a regulator, of course, delivering environmental regulation for businesses and other activities. But you're doing so much more now that's very proactive in the low carbon space, running emissions trading schemes, working proactively with high energy users to help them reduce their energy use. Do tell us more about this much wider role that you now have.
Well, thank you, Miranda. It's great to be here with you and delighted to be able to give a bit of a national overview of our work and to have Keith with me too, to talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing more locally. And yes, we're known as an environmental regulator. Yes, we're also known for the work that we do up and down the country on flood and coastal erosion risk management. I think one of the things that we are really keen for people to understand is when it comes to the Prime Minister's 10-point plan that he launched several months ago, that people understand the role we play underpinning a lot of that work, whether it's around hydrogen strategies, whether it's around nature's recovery, whether it's around emissions trading. You touched on that in the question. We have a role as the environmental regulator to underpin the green industrial revolution. And one of the things I talk about is the fact that our green industrial revolution needs strong green industrial regulation to underpin that work. And so a lot of that hasn't necessarily been understood by the wider general public or the business community. We've also thought about our own role, not only in helping the country deliver net zero, but our role in terms of delivering net zero. So perhaps we will come on to that later. But one of the joys of my role as we come out of lockdown is the ability to go around the country to look at the various things that we do and how we can help industry prepare for net zero and allow our regulatory activity to underpin that work. I think another area perhaps we'll come back to is our work on green finance. So again, a core part of the 10-point plan is also to recognise that in addition to public sector money, we need private sector money. And again, strong regulation has a role in underpinning that. And we at the Environment Agency have a small team across the country focusing on green finance and how we can work with other departments to deliver on that. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Yes, we'll definitely touch back on your own internal journey to net zero and your work that's undergoing at the moment and aspirations for the future, but also about that green financing theme, because you know we have a project ourselves that's working in that area, in the local area, which Keith is very much part of. So we'll definitely come back to those themes. Looking at your background as an agency working with businesses, Do you find that businesses respond well to having a strong and clear environmental regulatory environment? Does that help them feel assured of their sort of positive performance and work towards profitability in a way of, with that security of knowing that they're operating correctly?
And I think that goes back to what I was saying about a green industrial revolution needs strong green industrial regulation to underpin it. We have to recognise that the majority of businesses wants to act and operate within the law. Increasingly, investors and businesses want to go beyond where the law is, particularly as people understand the significance of climate change, the need to both reduce emissions, prepare for environmental shocks, the flooding that we're seeing, the heat waves that we're seeing, the fires that we're seeing, the droughts that we are seeing, as well as relying and depending on nature's recovery and a strong natural environment. So it's important that we as the Environment Agency, we as an environmental regulator, are working closely with industry to understand how best to underpin that corporate activity. We also need to recognise that in any industry, probably a tiny little percentage, with the reporting we do around our regulatory framework and the good, and there's the good side of it, but there's also the bad and the ugly side of it. We need to make sure that there is strong enforcement and strong penalties, and that is an area that we have been working on too, and businesses support that framework. They want a level playing field. They want to understand the direction of travel as far as environmental regulation goes. They see the importance of a 25-year environment plan and all of this joining together, but also recognise that an agency such as ours and our sister agencies in the devolved administrations, but also those working on the natural environment, need to have the right tools to enforce our regulation. And everything that we look at shows that with the right framework, the right resources, we can deliver environmental improvements. And I think we also need to recognise that the country as a whole will get the environment it's prepared to pay for. So increasingly we will see responsible business, and that's the majority of businesses, absolutely wanting to make sure that organisations such as ours are resourced well. Keith, I don't know if you want to bring in anything more locally to add to my answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think you've covered it incredibly well. I mean, bringing some local context, as you say, we deal with a wide spectrum of businesses, from world-class leaders who, as you say, want to go beyond regulation because they realise regulation gives a level of assurance and a level of protection and confidence in terms of protecting local air, land and water, through to others who are currently spending time at Her Majesty's pleasure, who actively undercut legitimate businesses. So I think what we're seeing increasingly is actually that the green credentials and carbon credentials are acting as a positive sort of marketing element in terms of that sort of ambition to move forward rather than being retrospective and carbon intensive. I think there's also clearly strong supply or increasing supply chain expectations internally and externally and internationally. And I think, again, Lancashire's sort of history of innovation at an industrial scale, I think, just prepares us to be strong on that front. You touched on regulation, often seen as kind of a headwind. Actually, for most businesses, it actually helps to create a conversation around environmental efficiency and benefit, because ultimately, if you're losing water, heat, electricity, you're losing money. So, if you think carbon's money, how do we optimize those costs, I think is really important. And that's the kind of regulatory, if you will, conversation we're wanting to create, which is much more about and we have a corporate stance around yes if. How do we enable sustainable growth is actually one of the 3 pillars of our next 5-year plan. It's absolutely about protecting the environment, but it's also about enabling sustainable growth. And I think the work that the Chamber have done and the LEP have done is really driving that well across Lancs.
I think you're absolutely right. As always with business, you'll get those who are the early adopters, who are really seeing this as a flag to wave, and they're doing it and breaking new ground and spending money on it. But then you have the vast majority in the middle who are weighing up the priorities, and they need to understand that their customers and their clients and their employees are going to be more challenging in the future. And we'll see in the public sector contracts much higher baselines of environmental proactivity being required from customers. But as you say, then the next piece is making sure our businesses understand the cost that behaving badly in this form, all of those utility bills that are being spent and literally money going up in smoke if they're not being proactive about managing those energy prices and looking at the energy price shocks we're hearing about this week. It's all of that narrative, I think, isn't it? And making sure that gets across, but then making sure that there is a legislatory stick behind the laggards in this to make sure the whole business space moves in that direction. It's got to be all of those things, hasn't it? And also, really welcome, I think, is the fact that we're trying to make sure there's a level playing field for people, because that's always the biggest criticism if things aren't fair. And I think we've got to make sure with the imports coming in from overseas that we make sure that that's fair in terms of comparison of carbon impact as well. I think that'll be something that becomes more and more prominent as we go on.
And that's another area, Miranda, where I have done some work. So I was invited to become one of the advisors to the Board of Trade. We've obviously just seen a change in lineup at the Department of Trade, with Liz Truss moving to the Foreign Office and Anne-Marie Trevelyan arriving as the new Secretary of State. The Board of Trade is working with the ministerial team on a series of reports, and I was really pleased that the former Secretary of State took the advice of the advisors to accelerate the publication of a green trade report, which we published back in July. The original plan was to have it published just before COP26. But we felt it was so integral to setting out the UK's ambition around trade, and to make sure that the environment, climate change is understood in the context of our trading activities, that it was accelerated and published earlier in the summer. And I think that has opened out the conversations about that level playing field in terms of imports and exports, and how to make sure that all of the activity that we want to see in this country because of our net zero commitments isn't undermined because of activity that takes place overseas. So again, we've seen progress take place in terms of thinking of our trade policy through that lens. And having worked with Anne-Marie Trevelyan as a COP26 ambassador on adaptation and resilience, the role that she has, but also where she was in the Department of Business with responsibilities for green energy and green finance, I have no doubt that she will bring that work with her to her work as the new Secretary of State, the new Trade Secretary.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a really positive direction of travel, because I've worked with Anne-Marie also in her previous role, on the fact that she's coming into that Department of Trade role with energy in mind and with level playing field, and also with economic advantage for the UK and exporting some of our energy solutions. That's a very good place to come from. Looking at energy solutions, obviously we've seen huge changes in our energy mix over the last few years, and a lot of our carbon reduction targets being achieved because of that transition, but you're going to have a much wider role, it looks like, in the future in managing a whole range of diverse energy solutions, aren't you, in terms of whether that's more renewables feeding into the grid, whether it's hydrogen feeding directly in, and even new nuclear. Is this a role that you're positioning the EA to take going forward?
Well, we do have very specific regulatory roles, not just in relation to the UK emissions trading scheme, how that's transitioned from being European to UK focused, how that might expand. And we are in active discussions with our department, but also with the Department of Business Bays to look at how the scope of the UK emissions trading scheme may evolve, but also how we work with other regulators in terms of the energy mix. So whether it is nuclear, where we have a role, or some of the emerging technologies. I was on a visit last week to the Northeast. I was in Newcastle, where again, we are working in partnership there with the City Council in terms of their ambitions to reach net zero by 2030, the Coal Authority, and where again looking at temperature differentials to bring in a kind of geothermal energy out of the coal mines. And I think we, as the environmental regulator, want to be as enabling as we can be, whilst being absolutely mindful of our role protecting the environment. And I suppose my advice to businesses as we look at this work is to get involved with the Environment Agency early on as possible. We know with the large infrastructure projects that we get involved with, the sooner we are invited in for advice, the sooner we can be helping, making sure that the right thing is done at the right time. And that in itself will lead to fantastic efficiencies, will lead to the project happening more quickly, and can be very much an advantage to those businesses working with us. And whether over time we need to look at new forms of charging structures, those are all of the things that we need to look at as a modern and innovative environmental regulator. Keith, is there anything you'd like to add from a local perspective?
Yeah, as you say, Emma, we have different roles relating to as to whether it's hydropower through to nuclear. So we host in the Northwest one of our 2 nuclear regulation groups, and I have a team working with developers around reactor design. Clearly, we had the proposal up at Moorside, up in Cumbria, next to Sellafield, which is still an identified site for which, and I was up there last Friday actually. And seeing fuel rods that are manufactured at Springfields. So clearly we have the full cycle in the Northwest of fuel manufacture through to ultimate disposal. So, and that's, Sellafield, 11,000 jobs. So I think our role in working with those sectors, I mean, it's also just perhaps worth mentioning, I know Dave Wellesby, Chief Exec at Hindburn, and Jack Spees, Chief Exec of the Ribble Rivers Trust and Chair of the Lancashire Nature Partnership, are on the call as well. The group that we are creating is to provide this kind of a hub for climate change, whether it's environmental, economy or community, is really growing. And we've drawn into that group now following a conversation with Electricity Northwest. So our electricity network, strong ambitions around decarbonisation, recognising the need for growth, but also just drawn in Cadent, who are the gas network managers. Steve Fraser, who lives in Lancashire, is their newish chief exec, is very much around the hydrogen conversation and decarbonising sort of the gas systems as well. So I think again, well placed as a county in terms of leading and being at the front edge of some of that innovation.
No, indeed, we are seeing an awful lot of collaboration now starting to build, which is really important. Those links where we've got the public sector, the Environment Agency, Electricity Northwest, and then innovative businesses working together it's really good to see that. And I think there's a lot of political change that's really helping us drive in that direction recently as well. It's all very positive, and now it's about getting those results coming out of that, the move with the public sector, but also the private sector to really shift in that direction. This leads us well on to the next place I wanted to go. A lot of our conversation today stems from a speech you gave in March, which is when we started talking about doing this. That shows how long it takes to do anything in COVID times. And in that speech, you used the same quote of Joe Biden's that I've used several times when speaking about climate change, where he said, if I look at climate change, I see jobs, jobs, jobs. And do you see this proactive investment in new low carbon technologies as a great part of the regeneration post-COVID and the levelling up agenda for the North?
I do, but I also would like to draw it far more broadly than the low carbon agenda. I think we need to look at water resources, water quality. I think we need to look at land use, how we farm, the growing interest in our natural environment and how important nature can be to protecting us from future climate change. So from my perspective, this is a strong part of our recovery, having a green strand all the way through it. But I also think it's going to be important for many, many years to come. And if I were a student today, I would be looking at how any discipline could lead to a job with a green focus to it. Such is the climate emergency now and the nature emergency that we need to be looking at any decision we make through the lens of the climate emergency and really understand the impact that we're having. So that arguably is around the jobs that will become available. Now, I appreciate that is easier said than done, but I am feeling very encouraged, having worked with him when he was Environment Secretary, that Michael Gove will be now leading the new Ministry for Levelling Up, with a strong focus on housing, obviously local government and communities, and that sense of the opportunity if we get this right, but equally the risk if we get it wrong. So if you're building houses, they need to be fit for the future so that they don't wash away in a flood. They have water supplies in a drought, but equally they are being built with net zero and low carbon and energy efficiency in mind. And again, nature can play a massive part, even in an urban environment, to make sure that we build the future housing, we have the future land use that we'd like to see. Massive opportunities. And certainly that's where I would encourage your members to be focusing as businesses, not just through that narrow framing, important as it is around low carbon, but the broader environmental agenda too. Thank you.
No, that's excellent to hear. The climate resilience and nature-based solutions is definitely something we'll come back to in a moment and hear, I hope, about what's happening in the local area for us as well. But just looking at those innovations around low carbon technologies, this is something which we're working on heavily within the chamber, as well as our chamber low carbon program, which is there to work with all of the SMEs across Lancashire and help them have their carbon footprint and plan their journey to net zero, and then get support from the team that we have to actually make their progress towards that. That's the key point. Otherwise it's just a report. You need that ongoing support. We also have a project we run called Redcat, which is Lancashire's Centre for Alternative Technologies, where we're working with people who are developing brand new low carbon technologies, giving them the support as they develop those technologies, find their customers, and then most especially some commercialization funding early grant funding to help them start the manufacturing in the area. And then we help them go down the road of getting the next stage of venture capital or equity-based funding. And at the moment, some of those technologies that are being supported include bacterial treatments for pollution, heat pump manufacture, micro hydropower manufacture, waste treatment, and also more climate friendly structures to help even trees be planted. So it's the whole range from waste all the way through to climate resilience in the forestry environment. Green financing is something which I know you're passionate about the same way I am. It's a huge barrier to people helping these develop these technologies, but also now something which is starting to be built as a great opportunity. What would you like to tell us that we won't necessarily already know about that journey to really create green financing and help this low carbon technology development?
Well, my background is finance, so I've spent the vast bulk of my career working in finance and green finance in particular. I'm also currently interim chair of the Green Finance Institute, and as I said, I think earlier, at the Environment Agency, we've built up a small but very nimble green finance team, because we know a number of things. Partly, some of our work, we need to crowd in money from partners and other members of the public sector as well as the private sector. We also know that there is a lot of money that has been committed by banks and investors to become net zero and climate resilient. And we need to funnel that through to the real projects, the real businesses that are out there. And that is why the Green Finance Institute was set up by government. It came out of the government's green finance strategy as a way of being an interface between government, the public sector, and the private sector and the third sector to really try and unlock some of the blockers that we have seen. And the Environment Agency works closely with the Green Finance Institute. I think everybody recognises that you need to collaborate your way through this unlocking exercise. And whilst we as the Environment Agency will bring the skill set as a regulator, as a delivery body for flood risk management, we need to have enough internal skills so that we can work with the bankers and the investors to try and match those things up, whilst understanding that the policy framework and the strong regulation that we've talked about will underpin the investment that we need to see. So the Green Finance Institute is working on specific strands and setting up coalitions to really act as that interface, but also as a way of helping policymakers make those policy tweaks, perhaps internalising some of the costs that will then create the revenue streams, but really trying to make sure that we can unlock at scale some of that private sector investment and get it through to the businesses that will be the growth opportunities of the future. So and that's why it's just as important that we see jobs in finance as a way of delivering that money, or that transition, that focus on net zero. And the more we are collaborating and understanding the complexities of unlocking some of this growth, because it's much easier to talk about it than actually do it, the more that we will see investment flow through. And certainly some of the large scale measures that the government has introduced, like the UK Infrastructure Bank, like launching the first green sovereign bond, will start unlocking that finance. But we also need to make sure enough of that is taking place at the local and local government level. Thank you.
Absolutely. How, just a question stemming from that, how do we and this is a royal we, how do we all encourage government to make those changes in policy? So changes to planning policy so that any new build has got to be at a certain level, changes to procurement policy for all public sector contracts, so that how do we encourage them to make those changes that will help the market naturally progress in that direction? It's something I talk about daily with them.
I think it is about alignment of messages, and where I have seen things shift, it is because you have got business singing off the same hymn sheet as investors, singing off the same hymn sheet as civil society groups, and I think recognizing that whether it's as an individual or indeed as an organization or a representative of organizations, you have a voice. And then the more our voices are aligned and working in unusual alignments, the more likely it is that we will ultimately deliver on some of the policy changes. So I was part of the Green Finance Task Force as a member. I then was advising the government's response to the Green Finance Task Force, wearing my government hat or my chairing the Environment Agency hat. You just have to join and align those messages up. Having a strong voice of business and the investment communities aligned with those civil society messages is a really good way of pushing these things forward, and making sure that local representatives, whether it's through local government or indeed MPs, are hearing those messages too.
No, thank you very much. We'll endeavour to do more of that in partnership with you and Electricity Northwest and our local politicians, to try and, people like Dave and Jack who are on the call, to try and make sure government nationally and locally is hearing that joined up voice. Because like you say, that's sort of putting some of the people who they would naturally expect to speak against it in a pro camp. So that will help drive it forward. I think that's really helpful. So looking, as I said, at those nature-based solutions, we've got, I know, quite a lot of activity happening locally in terms of peatland and tree planting and managing soils. And I don't know, it might be either of you. What would you like to give us in terms of the insight about those climate resilience, nature-based solutions that you're already putting in place, and those that are in train?
So if I kick off, and then perhaps Keith can give a much more local flavour, because I think that the specifics always brings things to life around the country, but really pleased that we have this in Lancashire. We have been looking at piloting nature-based solutions and the finance around it. So really pleased that last summer we, with DEFRA, and the Esme Fairbairn Foundation and Triodos Bank, started piloting examples of where nature-based solutions could deliver financial revenue streams. And I know that Keith will talk about one of those, but I think this is the advantage that the Environment Agency can bring, is again that connection to the policymakers as a doer, as a delivery body. And by piloting examples, by working and setting up the different collaborations that are most relevant for the local area, you can start bringing to life what the opportunities are, but also bringing to life what needs to be unlocked to move from a pilot to delivering something at scale. So perhaps Keith, you'd like to talk about some of what we've been doing here in Lancashire. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And I suspect Jack Spees is about to burst with wanting to talk about some of the brilliant work that he and others are doing in terms of nature-based solutions, and have been doing for the past 10 plus years, actually. I think the other thing it highlights there is the Environment Agency hopefully are a key player, but we're not necessarily leading everything. But if we can facilitate or lead where we're not, I mean, just in terms of simple investment in protecting homes from flood risk, and admittedly, a lot of this has been kind of concrete and on the coast to cope with increasing sea levels and increased storminess. We've invested more than 150 million over the last 5 years, protecting more than 30,000 homes, and we'll be investing somewhere in the region of 240 million over the next 5 years, protecting homes. I think we'll see a pivotal shift from, if you will, traditional concrete, albeit low carbon concrete investment, to increase natural solutions, and those are schemes which kind of complement the traditional, if you will, walls solution, because we can't build walls ever higher. People won't live with that. So we need to look at these natural solutions. It's tempting to think, well, this is all about slowing the flow, sort of leaky dams, and actually they have multiple benefits. So they not just slow flood waters, but they also increase biodiversity. They also potentially increase carbon sequestration. We also have clearly a lot of peat within Lancashire, which is a key element. Clearly, that is actually, when it's degraded, that's releasing carbon. If you can re-wet and restore, and we've been successful in attracting significant money in to increase the re-wet, and a number of partnerships working across the county doing that. If you can then get it regenerating, then you are actually sucking carbon back in. The other dimension, and I say, Jack isn't texting me words by the side, but he might as well be, is actually connecting things like tree planting into the health agenda. So actually really connecting community, economy, and health. So sorry, I'm just about to be interrupted. I guess, and just in terms of the investment front, though, for me there are kind of two elements to it. One is, if you will, we talk in terms of climate change, in terms of mitigation. So let's reduce emissions. Traditionally, that is kind of easier to attract investment. Talking to Cadent recently, they put a green bond out for around hydrogen and had to stop people trying to invest at £450 million. The more difficult, but I think we are leading the way actually in Lancashire, is kind of is investment to adapt. So we are working with a bank, the Rivers Trust, and who are leading it actually, and an insurance company on the Wire catchment to invest upstream, which then reduces their risk downstream. Because if you reduce the risk of flooding, which we saw across more than 100 communities in 2015 in Lancashire, which affected homes and lives and livelihoods, so businesses affected as well. If you can reduce that risk, it reduces the risk exposure to businesses, and that's a benefit. Jack and I had a conversation with Sarah Kemp, the chief executive of the LEP, a couple of months back, because there's termed angel investors wanting to invest in Lancashire, but not really knowing where to land. And there's something about providing a really strong landing strip and welcome centre for investors who want to come and invest in the Lancashire environment. I think we're edging forward in terms of making real progress on that. So we're kind of really at the beginning of that journey, but I think we are making certainly as much, if not more, progress than most of the places. And as you say, Emma, a lot of this comes down to land management. It comes down to you need jobs, you need supply chain for all of those things to happen. They don't just happen through volunteers. These are potential businesses in themselves.
No, it is a very important point. In a moment, I'm just giving Steve a heads up. We'll ask Jack to come in and give us a couple of minutes on the practicalities of some of the things that are happening. But just to talk for a moment, to give Steve the ability to arrange that. It's that really important balance, isn't it, of making sure our business community also understands that climate resilience piece is massively important for them as an economic success story for Lancashire as well, because those impacts that climate can have on the business communities can be catastrophic, can't they? But I'm really glad that we're talking in partnership now about that climate resilience work and looking at supporting those angel investors in finding where to go, because part of the Redcat project and the Centre for Alternative Technologies for Lancashire is to look at setting up some offshoots from that funding coming in from large private sector investment and creating a climate resilience fund, which will be working with the Environment Agency, with UKIP specifically, to look at investments that can come into the local area. But if we can work also with Sarah at the Environment Agency and with those people who are looking to be angel investors in climate and low carbon technologies, to help them find those low carbon technology solutions, we have those and we can see the jobs created and the investment coming in. So this is our next conversation, isn't it? So let's just ask Jack momentarily to come in and give us just a quick rundown of some of the activity that's happening on the ground in that climate resilience field, please.
Thanks, Miranda. Yes, a little bit unexpected. Yeah, there's so much work going on across Lancashire within the environment sector at the moment. I can't possibly do it justice in a few minutes, let alone a few days, but we're really fortunate that we've got such strong partners like the Lancashire Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, the Woodland Trust. We've got huge amounts of woodland creation going on, and they're very targeted to do some of those things that Keith is describing in terms of reducing downstream flood risk and improving air quality. But we're also offering opportunities for carbon offsetting, and we're seeing increasingly Lancashire-based businesses wanting to do that offsetting locally, where they can see and almost feel the benefits more locally. But the amount of work going on in peat is phenomenal, and I'm talking with an international carbon broker at the moment around how Lancashire could attract some investment into carbon offsetting through peat. So, you know, there's just huge amounts of work going on, and you know, we as an environmental sector largely sort of getting into the right frame of mind for green finance. But we very much understand the huge array of benefits that we can offer, particularly around climate resilience.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Jack. Peat is often misunderstood by the general population outside of the north of England, isn't it? Everyone thinks in terms of tree planting, but actually we can make far greater inroads by better managing our peat resource, can't we, in terms of carbon sequestration?
Absolutely, and actually it goes further than sequestration in that degraded peat is actually a carbon emitter, and particularly lowland carbon, which we have a lot of in Lancashire. And I think I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but there was quite an eye-opening moment when the realisation of how much carbon was being emitted nationally through degraded peat, and so we needed to stop that emission and switch it into a sequestration.
No, that's super. Thank you very much, Jack. That's sorry to spring that on you, but it's always good to hear what's actually happening on the ground locally and how we go from national policy to regional to on the ground that we can literally see outside of the window. So coming back to something you mentioned earlier, Emma, about your own Environment Agency journey to manage net zero within the EEA. Can you tell us about your priorities and some of the activities that are already undergoing in that sphere, please?
Yes, absolutely. And again, really great to hear from Jack about some of the projects that he's working on here. We made our commitment to become net zero by 2030 back in, I think it was October 2019. And since then, I think that was based on the work we'd already done in terms of reducing our emissions profile. And we felt, given all of the attention at a national level around net zero and reaching that by 2050, we wanted to challenge ourselves to be as ambitious as possible. So knowing that we have delivered reductions in the past, knowing that we were setting ourselves a target, we also wanted to stretch ourselves even further and have nominally set ourselves an ambition to reach absolute net zero by 2050. So to reduce, to get to that level without any offsetting, really challenging, but we need to set ourselves those sorts of targets, particularly given our role as the environmental regulator. If we look at the areas that we're focusing on, the largest area for emissions is from our construction work and cement in particular. So we are working in partnership up and down the country with all of the contractors that we work with in terms of our construction work to reduce emissions, to trial innovative solutions such as ultra-low carbon concrete Also to remind people that it's not just about constructing new stuff, that actually by investing in maintenance, you can keep your existing infrastructure in good shape and make it last longer. And that has a role to play in terms of meeting our net zero. We can only achieve that target, particularly around our construction work, if we're working in partnership. And we know, as one of the first public sector bodies to make an earlier commitment to 2030, we sent a really strong signal through our procurement to the people we work with. And again, it's been brilliant to see councils and others make 2030 and even sooner commitments, different sectors as well. And because it's by sending that strong signal that we are showing what will be needed, and that cascades its way through all sorts of different infrastructure projects. So fantastic to hear from the permanent secretary of the Cabinet Office earlier this year that how wonderful it is that, and of course you would expect the Environment Agency to go earlier, and how other infrastructure departments need to become fast followers. And we've started seeing the government procurement rules change so that net zero is factored in, as indeed will be nature's recovery and biodiversity net gain. And again, I think that is an indicator of how an organisation, no matter how big or small, can really start sending signals elsewhere. So again, how smaller businesses, by setting a target, can influence larger organisations. We've got to look at our car fleet. That's another area. That's probably easier than the construction heavy vehicles that we use. We've got to look at our IT setup, see it both as a user of energy, but as we've experienced through COVID, a huge enabler as well. We've got to look more broadly at our travel, and I'm sure I've missed another area of core focus for us, but we've chunked it into various aspects of our operations to make sure that we're really looking at and learning of others how to deliver on our net zero target. Keith, I don't know if there's anything again more practical that you've been doing through your area.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we've kind of got a stated now climate ambition underpinning the net zero by 2030, and the key foundation of that is walking the walk. So we kind of say what you need to do, we need to do it. And as you said, part of that is sharing and learning. So we're opening conversations, just as we lead DEFRA fleet, for example, with other major players' fleets, because actually we might need to apply pressure to manufacturers. So as you say, electric is good up to about 3.5 tons, but not good for trucks. So I've just seen the advert, or the trailer, so to speak, for the carbon battle bus coming to Burnley on the 11th of October, which is fantastic. Just agreed to support that event. So really interested in that. So what are the technologies that are going to be on HGVs and heavy plant, and the major businesses across the north and the northwest who can learn from that. And a lot of this is about sort of the mechanics, but also the cultural stuff. So we're talking to staff around understanding our own footprint. So if anyone hasn't tried it, the World Wildlife Fund Carbon Calculator is a really good way of sort of tracking what is your impact and getting that just kind of a cultural element. I think there's a strong agenda here around getting into the education system in terms of future generation, educate the kids to put pressure on parents, which is we know that happens around litter and plastics and other things. So there are a whole host of things. In terms of the ambition, the other elements around our regulatory work, nationally, internationally, but also about supporting and working with local partners and local authorities around planning for a more resilient future. And this conversation is very much part of that. Preparing for resilience. There will be people on the call who've been flooded. I could show you a picture of Haweswater, the Northwest's header tank, currently at about 32% full. No immediate concerns around supply, but please be careful with water. But actually, if that stays dry during the winter, then we could have some significant issues next year. So we're kind of there are real risks, challenges, opportunities for businesses right across the county.
No, thank you for mentioning the COP26 battle bus event. Yes, that's on the 11th of October at Townley Hall. There's an invitation gone out this morning. If you haven't got an email about it, do email the chamber and we can pass it on to you. And we'd like to see any of our really invested businesses and partners involved in that coming and hearing what's being said. I just wanted to give Dave Welsby, who's the Chief Executive of Hyndburn Borough Council, the opportunity just to give us a couple of minutes on what's happening in the local area as part of all of those organisations working together. And then we'll come back to the big topic of COP26 for our last couple of minutes. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, so as Keith said earlier, there's a really strong partnership coming together now across Lancashire. We're involved in the LEP, the EA, Cadent, ENW, various groups, JAPS groups, the Lancashire Nature Partnership, Wildlife Partnership, and so on. And also, crucially, the National Farmers Union are also coming on board with their major role that they will have to play. Across Lancashire at the moment, there's a sea change, I would say, in terms of the approach that we're seeing. There's a lot of resource now being built up around environment and climate change within the local authorities. Most are committed to the 2030 deadline for net zero, and we will see, certainly following from all of that, lots of changes around procurement, land use, policy, and so on. A real focus now on what our priorities should be through the Greater Lancashire Plan. So 4 commissions have a near finalisation at the moment. The first is looking at Lancashire Net Zero Pathways, and that's going to look at carbon emissions and baselines across the whole of Lancashire and by each of the districts. The second is going to look at climate resilience and how we manage and cope with changes that are now inevitable and will continue to take place. The third is going to be looking at the stuff around the state of the environment, so the natural environment and the challenges, but also then the opportunities to improve. And the fourth, very much up your street, Miranda, the stuff around the renewable technology deployment, opportunities for businesses, and so on there. So some real crucial connections being made there. Really important to be working with organisations like Electricity Northwest. You know, when we have coming up through communities at the moment various schemes for things like solar farms and so on, with big political issues around the connection charges that are just kind of going to get in the way of that sort of localised energy generation. And we need to be influential, and we need to be pushing government on policy changes and resources. And just one further example, just coming out of the Lancashire Net Zero's pathways, and this is just one of many examples, in order for us to achieve net zero, we're going to have to retrofit a huge stock of domestic dwellings across Lancashire. So in areas like East Lancashire, where there is typically some poor housing, we're going to have to move from hundreds being retrofitted per year to tens of thousands. And therein, you kind of tackle then the government's agenda around levelling up, health, fuel poverty, housing conditions, but also you can see a multitude of opportunities for jobs, skills and economies in that.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Dave. It is both that opportunity, but also the risk if we don't act, isn't it? But thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Let's come finally to the event that we're all looking at really as a sort of focal point for this agenda at the moment, and that's COP26 in Glasgow in November. Obviously an international climate summit, and we're hoping that those world leaders really will make commitments. What do you think can realistically be achieved in terms of those commitments, and what can we hope to see as a result if they actually act on those? You're on mute, Emma, sorry.
Thank you for reminding me. I think it's that second point that you made, Miranda. It's the action that we need to see. And I think just hearing our spontaneous guests, Jack and David, speak about some of the action that is taking place, that gives me hope. That what goes on at COP is way beyond any of our pay grades, but what we do in this country to show that there is real ambition to act, and people are already on acting. That's what gives me hope that we will be able to deal with the climate emergency. So yes, I will continue to have some involvement in the global work that is carrying on. But one of the things I want to be able to do is channel in those conversations what I hear from people up and down the country about why this is important, the opportunities that it brings, the actions they are already taking, and the recognition that if they don't take those actions, that's where the risks increase. So that's what I'm hoping for. Resilience to climate shocks has to be a big part of that. We know that there's so much climate change already locked in that no matter what actions we take to reduce emissions, that will still happen. This has to work together. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That's the perfect place to come to a conclusion. And what we've really heard today is the sort of national policy direction and ambition, but also taking that down into the local activity that's really starting to make those things happen. And the last point to the most salient, it's an opportunity in terms of moves that we can make, jobs we can even create in those new technologies, but it's also recognizing the level of threat. And as you say, it isn't even just a threat that we can ward off completely. It's also something we need to be prepared to deal with the consequences that are coming, and to try and do that in partnership and together. And it's wonderful to hear from you and to know that we'll be carrying on over the next few months and years working together on this agenda. Thank you very much. Emma Howard-Boyd, chairs of the Environment Agency, and also Keith Ashcroft, our local director from Cumbria and Lancashire. Thank you very much, and to all of our attendees today.